Okay. To start back off, I didn't realize I had muted myself. So just wanted to welcome everybody to get us started. And just say that we're very happy to have all of you join us on this Wednesday morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are currently located, and joining us in this conversation. My name is Zareen Hamid. I'm the current WPS program manager at the Peace Women program at WILPF. Also joined by my colleague Genevieve Riccaboni, who is managing us from the back end. You might see her here on the screen. She's managing us on the back end, and she serves as our program associate at the WPS program. So we're going to be collecting questions from the chat throughout this call, and we're going to take them during the Q&A portion a little bit later. So before we get started, I'd like to give a very quick background, which our speakers will do a wonderful job expanding much further upon. We are here today to hear from two researchers from the London School of Economics and from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, who interrogated in a most recent report, Where Are the Words? The Disappearance of Women, Peace and Security, of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the language of country-specific UN Security Council resolutions. That's the title of the report. We will hear from them about the elements of this report and the pressing questions it tries to answer through analysis of country-specific resolutions on the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and the relationships of WPS and these resolutions with international law to better understand what insights these relationships can provide and how these insights can inform advocacy and policy. So our colleagues who wrote this report are here with us. We have Sarah Kenny-Werner, who works with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and coordinates FIRE, which is the Feminist Impact for Rights and Equality Consortium. She's most recently was a fellow with our WPS program at WILPF. And we also have Elena Stavrevska, hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly, at the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics, where Elena is, where she works on the Gendered Peace Project as a research officer. And in her work, Elena has looked at issues of gender and intersectionality and transitional justice, as well as other things in post-war societies, specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Colombia. And Elena's contribution for this report was enabled through the Gendered Peace Project, which was funded by the European Research Council under the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. So before we go to Elena and Sarah, I'd like to invite Madeleine Rees, WILPF Secretary General, and Christine Schenken, who is a professor of international law and the founding director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics, to give some opening remarks, and then we will move on to hearing from Sarah and Elena. Madeleine, Christine, hello. Thank you for joining us and welcome. I'd like us to start off hearing from you the motivation for this report and your thoughts on Security Council resolutions, which this report looks at. Madeleine, we will start with you and then move on to Christine. So please, you have the floor.
Right, thanks. I have the table with my computer on it.
You have the table.
I have a table. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful, and afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and thanks so much for joining. I'm really pleased that we have made this report real, and thanks to the two drafters who did such a wonderful job in putting it together. Where did this come from? Let's be brutally honest here. One, it was born of frustration. The frustration that so much time, effort, brain power, thinking, and really excellent analysis from the grassroots right the way through to those people who try to negotiate the language in the Security Council for the Women, Peace and Security resolutions. And where are we? Really, where are we in terms of the incredible progress that we should have made and should have seen making such a big difference on the ground in every peace mission and every other United Nations presence mission that there are around the globe? And we're not seeing it. We're not seeing the implementation. So where and how is all that work getting lost? Where's it going? So we started to look at the actual application of the language from the resolutions. Because if you put them all together, you have a normative framework, which Christine will talk a little more about, which should be revolutionary. It should be transformative. It should make all the difference. And instead, when you look at that implementation, it's not there. So we wanted to try and find out, where do the words get lost? And if the words get lost, how does that make an impact on what actually happens? And so that was really the trajectory of thought behind the investigations that have been undertaken and have led to this report. I think it's a really significant contribution to our understanding of how the system could and should be made to work, so that the incredible efforts that women around the world have made to try to claim the Women, Peace and Security agenda are actually realized through its implementation. So I'm going to talk no more. I'll hand it over to Christine, who can say more on what the legal application, the legal meaning of these resolutions and their comparative weight are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madeline. And I would also like to join in congratulating Sarah and Eleanor on a great report. And as ever, Madeline, for having the vision behind the need and bringing it in. The only point I really want to make is to point out the difference between the two sets of resolutions. The country-specific United Nations Security Council resolutions are typically routinely adopted under UN Charter Chapter 7. This means that they are decisions of the Security Council which member states have agreed to implement under Article 25 of the United Nations Charter. So essentially, country-specific resolutions, those resolutions that set out various actions to be undertaken by member states, are binding on those member states. In contrast, the Women, Peace and Security resolutions are what are commonly called thematic resolutions. They typically do not spell out which provisions of the Charter they are adopted under. The assumption is that they are Chapter 6 resolutions, and that means that they are essentially non-binding resolutions. They are recommendations. Essentially, the Security Council is calling upon states, urging states in various ways, trying to influence state behavior and behavior of various other international actors that are not formally legally binding upon them. However, and I think the however is really important, there are ways in which this is not quite as simple to say Chapter 7 binding, Chapter 6 thematic resolutions non-binding. First, there is of course the weight of the Security Council itself. It creates important political expectations where we have 10 resolutions adopted in a 20-year period. Certainly one would expect that this means something, and it should mean something with respect to implementation and following through the expectations that have been created. Secondly, a great deal of the resolutions do in fact reflect, echo, spell out, make more explicit already existing rules of international law. And as they are already existing rules of international law, they are therefore binding upon states as those pre-existing rules of international law. The Security Council is doing no more than reiterating what is already binding upon states with respect to a number of provisions. And then thirdly, in at least 2 of the WPS resolutions, the Security Council uses the important word decide. It says that it is decisions in these respects with respect to its own behavior. So the Security Council decides that it will in fact follow up on its resolutions, will take certain actions, and since it has undertaken within its own resolutions to make such a commitment, it seems appropriate that it should indeed be held accountable when it fails to carry through upon those commitments that it has made. And so I think the importance of this report is to say, look, here has the Security Council committed itself to actions with respect to progressing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, progressing it in specific instances in its country-specific resolutions. And where it has failed to do that, then we should ask questions why and urge that the council be made accountable for its own failure. So I think probably over to the two researchers to explain just what it is that has been omitted from those country-specific resolutions.
And thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Christine, and Madeline for your remarks and giving context to the motivations for this report. So we're going to turn now to Sarah and Elena to take us through the report. And then as you know, as they're speaking, if there are questions that come up for you among our participants, please do put them into the chat where my colleague Genevieve is is monitoring that portion of the Zoom, and then we will get to those during the Q&A. So Elena and Sarah, I welcome you to take the floor or the table to discuss the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Serene, and Madeline and Christine and the WILPF WPS team and the team at the LSE Center for WPS for organizing this. I know I speak for Elena when I say we are really excited to be here and to have all of you here, wherever here might be. So thanks for joining us. The structure of our presentation is straightforward, and I'm going to try to stick to it, even though I already want to be speaking to things that Madeline and Christine have raised, but I will stick to it. So briefly, first we'll get into the purpose and methodology, then Elena and I will share some of our findings, and then we'll talk about what they mean and how they might be applied, so the implications of them and the uses for them. After that, we'll hear from you in the Q&A section, and we'll get to have a conversation about all of this, which I'm excited about. So to kick us off, Zareen covered this somewhat, so did Madeline, so I won't go into it in too much detail. But the purpose of the report was to say that we have these 10 WPS resolutions, which have this enormous transformative potential. And why don't we see that translating into country-specific resolutions? And so we wanted to set that question and those that flow from it against the backdrop of the WPS agenda's relationship to international law. And we sought to clarify that relationship and see how all of that informs our engagement of and with the Security Council. So to that end, we did 3 things, and the structure of the report flows from this. So first, we situated the WPS resolutions, as Christine so elegantly said, as sources of commitments that are reflective of international legal obligations. Then we mapped these commitments, and then we grounded them within the country-specific resolutions, also through taking an initial look at the contribution of women CSO briefers. As Christine mentioned, the international legal piece is really crucial for the framing and the value of the research. It's hard not to conclude, as Christine said, that it doesn't represent some form of legal obligation. And also in the context of country-specific resolutions, the distinction that Christine noted between, specifically around Chapter 7, it makes the incorporation of WPS resolutions all the more relevant because they do have a more decisive impact once they're in those resolutions. So to the next 2 pieces, the mapping and the grounding. The mapping involved, as perhaps will be a shock to no one, an in-depth, holistic reading of the WPS resolutions, as well as a line-by-line, word-by-word reading. So who are the actors, what actions and ideas are being put across, how is it being repeated or carried through within the resolutions themselves. So through that process, we developed an understanding of the operative paragraphs of these resolutions as housing sets of commitments. So they shouldn't be taken individually and said, okay, operative paragraph 1, actually operative paragraph 1, looking even at 1325, the first operative paragraph, can actually be broken down further, and that's what we should aim to implement. So just as an example, if one resolution urges the increased participation of women in national, regional, and international institutions. That's not a single action that we need to be taking around that operative paragraph. Actually, it's three, because in order for these things to be realized, you have to take different strategies, and it also involves different actors. So then as part of this process as well, we traced the evolution and usage of key terms over time. So one example of what we did there that we included in the report was the evolution of the term civil, political, and economic rights, which actually appears in that form for the first time in Resolution 2493, but which has a longer evolution within the context of the earlier WPS resolutions. And then also we looked at, so trying to figure out, for example, what the word gender means in the context of WPS resolutions and how is it used. The grounding of these resolutions consisted of examining how the WPS resolutions are carried forward into country-specific resolutions in practice. So to do that, we analyzed the Security Council's incorporation of these commitments in a time-delimited way. So for those resolutions adopted between 2018 and 2019. Then we also looked at 4 focus countries and all of the resolutions adopted around those country situations. So that was DRC, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. We also looked at how the UN does this, what their approach is to this, to avoid duplicative work, and actually found that to be a useful starting point, but didn't think it was a sufficient endpoint, which Elena will talk about that in more detail later. We took also a brief and initial look at the implementation of WPS commitments that were carried forward as monitored and reported on and evaluated by the UN. And lastly, we reviewed the role and the place of CSO briefers, who we believe are not necessarily given their due in terms of the contribution that they make. So that will lead us into some of the key findings of the report, which we'd like to highlight. So through the mapping process that I discussed earlier, we found 2,500 WPS commitments that housed within 210 operative paragraphs of the 10 WPS resolutions, with 20 plus specific actors that are responsible for implementing them. So actors that have been named within those operative paragraphs. It's of note also that there were arguments made around these figures. The number listed is more conservative. But for us, this finding really demonstrates the magnitude and the scope and also the potential of the WPS resolutions and creates further questions about whether or not we're really realizing it in the way that I think is sometimes put forward. Now, Elena will share more about what we found when we trace these commitments into the country-specific resolutions.
So yes, Sarah told you the good news. There's a lot of commitments. I will share the bad news. The bad news is that you can look at these commitments, but one place where you won't find them are the country-specific resolutions. So we thought, as Christine was explaining, there are 2 types of Security Council resolutions, thematic and country-specific. And since the UN Security Council incorporates WPS into by its own resolutions, is supposed to incorporate non-thematic, WPS into non-thematic resolutions as well, we thought it would be the lowest bar possible to check whether they actually do that. In other words, we were trying to check whether the left hand knew what the right hand was doing, or as I like to call it, the Sinatra test. If you can make it here, you really can make it anywhere. So we looked, I told you I'll be talking about bad news. So we looked at, as Sarah said, Security Council resolutions across time, 2 years, 2018 and 2019, during which period 104 Security Council resolutions were adopted, of which 72 were country specific. We also looked at across space, and I'll get to that in a second. So across time, we actually applied UN's methodology. And in our own approach, we actually go further. I will explain this as well. But if we were to apply UN methodology, which we did, 62 of those 104 Security Council resolutions adopted in 2018, 2019 incorporate WPS language and commitments. This is about 60%. But of the country-specific resolutions, actually, the percentage is similar there. 43 of the 72 incorporate WPS language as well. But then we also looked across space with the focus on the 4 countries that both Zareen and Sarah mentioned. In selecting these countries, we were not necessarily aiming to have a representative sample of countries because personally, I'm not sure that's possible. But we were looking to have a diverse set of cases in terms of length of mandate, type of UN engagement, as well as UN mechanisms involved. Some of them combine different mechanisms on the ground. It is also important to know that across these resolutions and across these 4 cases, the pen holders differ as well. So for instance, France has been the pen holder for DRC since 2016, UK for Yemen also since 2016. Germany and UK have taken part as pen holders for Libya, and there have been various pen holders for Syria. So now on to the methodology about these country-specific resolutions. When looking at the 4 cases, we analyzed 3 things. The first thing, as Sarah was mentioning, is the incorporation of these 2,500 commitments into the resolutions. The second thing, and this is where we differ from UN's methodology on analyzing the incorporation of WPS, we looked at the strength of the language that's being used in the country-specific resolutions. So what we mean by that is that in examining the resolutions, we excluded 3 sets of references. The first one is those that involve condemnation or regret set forth surrounding deaths of or violence against women, but not necessarily generating commitments directed at addressing these deaths or violence. The second set are references that retain the same language within the same context, so for the same country, from one year to the next, or sometimes when they are weakened, and this has happened as well, from one year to the next. So these were excluded essentially to try to avoid double counting. The third type of references that we excluded are those that were references to UN-related sexual exploitation and abuse, which in a way is sort of a problem that would not have been created without UN's presence in the country. So while the UN, the references are reflective of the UN's efforts to resolve a problem, that problem itself originates within the UN and otherwise would not have been present in the context. So to clarify here, UN's methodology, specifically the Secretary General and UN Women's methodology on evaluating the incorporation of WPS in the Security Council resolutions, provides the whole universe of mentions of women, gender, and so on. However, our narrowing down is specifically about commitments to action and commitments to advancing the agenda itself. So those are 2 things we looked at. The third thing that we looked at in terms of implementation, and this is where we fall short because there's so many other things we could have looked at. We could have talked to civil society on the ground. We could have looked at different reports, but due to the limitations that we had in terms of time, we looked at specifically at Secretary General reports on each mandate, as well as publicly available materials and reports from different offices and envoys related to the mandates. And we looked at those to see whether, and if so, how, these WPS commitments are actually carried forward in practice. Now, on to the countries. So, as I said, these are quite a diverse set. Libya has a short mandate with imposed sanctions, and the Security Council has passed a total of 36 resolutions on Libya between 2011 and 2019. Only 8 of those, or for the number-loving people among you, 22%, were found to incorporate WPS references. But looking at the available materials and reports, our preliminary analysis shows that none of these commitments are actually carried forward in practice in UN's work in Libya. We can go back to these in the Q&A. I'll try to be brief here though. In the case of Syria, the mandate operates in conjunction with UNHCR mandate, as well as a commission of inquiry. And the UN Security Council has passed 24 resolutions between 2012 and 2019. Only one of those, or 4%, incorporates WPS language, which is not a strong reference and is also not carried forward in practice. In the case of Yemen, that is another mission that operates in conjunction with a UNHCR mandate and Commission of Inquiry, as well as incorporation of sanctions. And the Security Council has passed only 13 resolutions between 2011 and 2019. 5 of those, or 38%, incorporate WPS importantly within their operative paragraphs. But none of those are actually strong references, as I explained before. So for instance, and in terms of carrying these forward in practice, we looked at the 3 reports produced by the Secretary General, who is committed to, and I quote, report on progress regarding implementation of Resolution 2451, end of quote. But the Secretary General in this case did not comply with the commitment to report on women's participation. This commitment is regarding women's participation. In fact, women are not even referenced in the context of any of the 3 reports. So here too, the WPS commitments are actually not carried forward in practice. The final one, and this one we had the most work with, which is the DRC, because it's the longest mandate. And the mandate is from 2000 until 2000, well, we've looked at between 2000 and 2019. And curiously, this actually overlaps with the appearance of the WPS agenda as well, which is important, or we thought was important. In that time period, the Security Council passed 71 resolutions, of which about half, 36, contain WPS language, and 11 of those were actually strong references. In fact, 8 of them, and we did not find this in the other cases, specifically cite WPS resolutions. And this is important because the WPS agenda and the mandate for DRC have evolved in parallel. So there is something to be said about the possibility of an evolving language incorporating another evolving agenda or another evolving theme. Bad news here too, though, in terms of the commitments being carried forward. It was also not the case in the UN's work in DRC. So to give you an example here, we analyzed the implementation of WPS commitments around women protection advisors that emanate from both the Security Council resolutions about DRC and those on WPS. And while information on women protection officers in general appears in Secretary General thematic reports, these commitments are not tied to the relevant WPS resolutions. And it is of note that the Secretary General actually does not list the number of women protection officers staffed at each mission. So the initial analysis here has found actually absence of information on whether, and if so how, women protection advisors have fulfilled the responsibilities. This leads me to the third finding, which is that the UN Security Council does receive and has the opportunity to actually receive enough information to act on the WPS agenda and its implementation in country-specific contexts. So one such mechanism, as I already mentioned, are the UN Secretary General's reports. But as we note in the cases we analyzed, the UN Security Council actually does not act on the information and sometimes does not receive the information it should receive on the status of the implementation of WPS agenda within in this context. The fourth and final finding here is on another mechanism that exists, which we spent quite some time and with pleasure analyzing. And this is the possibility to invite women briefers from civil society organizations. Specifically, we analyzed the statements of women CSO briefers on Syria, Raja Al-Tali, who is a co-founder and co-director of the Center for Civil Society and Democracy, and on DRC, Julienne Lusange, who is director of the Congolese Women's Fund. In analyzing their statements, what we thought was interesting, and hopefully you think so too, it demonstrates how actually information shared with the UN Security Council is very deeply rooted and even furthers both WPS language and agenda and country-specific commitments. It also shows how information provided by these briefers could fill the gap left by the lack of information on the implementation of WPS commitments within the Secretary General's report. This information should be reflected in UN Security Council resolutions and actions. However, so far we have found, despite the tremendous effort and even risks that women take to brief the Security Council, so far it has not been the case. I will stop there, and Sarah will tell you what do we do with all of this.
Yeah, so great. I like hearing it. I like talking about it. One thing that I want to bring up though, to the 51% on DRC, I know that seems like a high figure, but bad news again. I wish I could leave it to Elena. But that is reflective more of the duration of the mandate than of the UN's effectiveness in incorporating WPS into the mandate. So it shouldn't require time. If we really have progressed, we should be able to be getting the kinds of language in DRC mandates that we see now. We should be getting that from go. We shouldn't have to start from scratch every single time that we approach a new country-specific situation. Okay, so getting into, we can maybe go into it into the Q&A. But getting into possible uses now, there are so many. For all of us here on the call, for all of us doing such different but interconnected work. So whether you consider yourself an academic or a peace activist or a diplomat, or you work within the UN, or it's some mixture of these. First, let me just say that I hope that this will be a starting point rather than an ending point for what you do with the report. And then also there's an accompanying guide. And actually, I would love to hear, I see some people are already commenting, but I would love to hear more about your ideas and plans for this research or for furthering the research if you've already done it. I'm looking forward to hearing about that. But just quickly on the topic of women CSO briefers, heading into recommendations, reiterating what Elena said, and particularly to the risks that they take to provide us with that information. I think it's worth being very clear that we have to use it. We really have to use that information and ensure that it's known that we're using it, particularly in light of the insufficiency of the reporting on WPS provisions within the SG's reports on country-specific situations. Hopefully that will be rectified by this SG before he leaves, and the next SG who comes in, who should be feminist. So this information should be reflected within formal and informal diplomatic efforts. We should also see, goes without saying, Elena said it, we should also see that information reflected in country-specific resolutions. On the subject of the remarks of the CSO briefers, the UN Security Council's language doesn't serve us. It's inaccessible. Hopefully this report and the guide make this less so, but the fact remains that, like the forum itself, it's inaccessible. Doesn't serve us. But the resolutions on women, peace, and security have served us, and they do serve us. So, and we know them, speaking to activists now, we know them better than anyone else does. So in speaking with the Security Council, let's say what needs to be heard and give them the information that they need to do what we want them to do. But also let's specifically reference the resolutions in doing so. We've showed how this might be done in the report in our analysis of the recommendations put to the council by Ms. Altali and Ms. Lusenge, as Elena quickly referenced there. And also that specific referencing is something that's critically important for those involved in the drafting of country-specific resolutions. So when we incorporate the commitments emanating from the WPS resolutions within resolutions on country situations, let's cite to them. Let's cite specifically to them, and also to all 10 of them and not just 1325 would be good. As much as I love that particular resolution, and I'm sure as much as we all do, really. And also, I think on the drafting of WPS provisions, that should be done in an incisive way. So that needs to be done with an eye to their disassembly and their implementation and also their legal significance. So Sir Michael Wood from the International Law Commission noted that part of the trouble in the interpretation of the resolutions is that they're not always done in anticipation of its interaction with international law. So then let's anticipate it. Let's also, in that drafting to that point, but I think it also works for advocacy, let's be consistent in our use of terms and build on the meanings and associations that are already present within the WPS resolutions. So we looked at, as I mentioned earlier, gender and the evolution of other terms. There's more work that needs to be done there, so please take up that mantle. And then next, more needs to be done to establish connections across the UN. Whether it's other thematic topics like youth, peace, and security, or whether it's human rights bodies and resolutions, they're mutually reinforcing, and strengthening the connections between this work strengthens the force of both. So the report does take a step in that direction. That's one of the reasons why we were interested in covering the DRC and why we thought it would be a good example to use. But more needs to be done here, particularly around the interplay between commissions of inquiry, which is a feature of Syria, and Security Council resolutions more generally. And I wish that was something that was better understood. So I'd encourage the pursuit of more research and understanding there. And then for those of us working in advocacy, we can make these kinds of connections within the context of our work around national action plans, for example, our work with regional bodies and their policy agendas, which I think is sometimes overlooked and not spoken about enough. And then, of course, as I mentioned, these other human rights mechanisms. So I hope what's come across here is that there's a real need to focus on realizing the potential of the WPS resolutions at an almost granular level. So the WPS agenda is it's like electrons. You know what I mean? It's contains the most basic things that we need to happen. It permeates everything else. It's the stuff that the work that we do is composed of. So I think in many ways, the WPS agenda contains not only our imagination of what could be or what should be, but it also contains and I think stretches our imagination of what actually is. And I think that's actually an exercise that sometimes is a bit harder. And I think that's something that if there's one thing that you take away, I hope that it's that we need to be doing more of that. I'm gonna stop talking so we can get into the Q&A soon. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So Zareen, you can maybe take us away.
Sure, thank you. I almost continue to speak without unmuting again. Great, thank you to you, Elena and Sarah, for walking us through this report. I know it was a lot of hard work and thought and follow through on this. So it's really great to be hearing from you both on the content of the report. We're taking questions. So please do add your questions to the chat, and we're compiling them and we'll be posing them to our speakers. So I'm going to cover some of our first questions to the speakers. So, and also Madeline and Christine, please also feel free to jump in if you would like to take on any of the questions. So the first one is, why are these findings important, and what should they mean for policymakers and for civil society organizations? I won't call on anyone. Please, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Right. So why are they important? They're important not just because they kind of open up a certain area that we hope, as Sarah mentioned, that we hope will be explored further. But they're important for, I think, three things. One is, as Christine and Madeline were saying, holding the UN to account, both from civil society organizations and activists, but also different advocates for the WPS agenda and different elements of the WPS agenda within the UN system. The second thing is to also hold to account and lobby with Security Council members. because as I said, there have been different pen holders, and some of them are more, are bigger WPS advocates than others, and not necessarily the veto power members. The third one, though, is that I think it holds the potential for comparative purposes in a way. So we've looked at 4 countries, and what we've learned from these 4 countries can be applied. So not just the counting of the resolutions, but if you look at the report, there's a bit more detailed analysis there. But what we've learned from these 4 countries can be compared from other countries. And there might be countries, and in fact, there are countries where this has been done somewhat better. And here I would like to invite, I think she's on the call, Professor Catherine O'Rourke, who is director of the Transitional Justice Initiative. I had the pleasure of recently listening to a talk about her forthcoming book, Women's Rights in Armed Conflicts Under International Law. And in it, she analyzes 3 countries, DRC, Nepal, and Colombia. And I think it would be useful to hear some of her findings along the similar vein as well. Catherine, are you here?
I'm here, thank you.
Oh.
Hi, colleagues. It's nice to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll speak very briefly. Elena mentioned that I just completed some work that'll be published in the coming weeks. It's a new book with Cambridge, and it's funded by the Department for International Development. And in this research, I looked at a rather narrower question and on slightly different case studies, but I was interested in how the monitoring mechanisms and enforcement procedures that have been attached to the WPS resolutions, how those were interfacing with the Security Council's country-specific activities. And these sort of narrower findings on a narrower evidence base, certainly broadly reaffirm what Elena and Sarah have found very clearly, which is what I call norm misalignment. So the Security Council's failure really to align its country-specific activities with its normative commitments. And in the DRC, I think this was particularly acute because the procedure that the Security Council established to the MARA mechanism, monitoring, report and analysis under Resolution 1960, which was put in place to establish a meaningful mechanism to monitor conflict-related sexual violence, and in fact even to list perpetrators. At the same time as that mechanism was listing the Congolese army repeatedly as a perpetrator of sexual violence in conflict. Of course, the main focus of the country mission was through the intervention brigade, which was there to reinforce the offensive capacity of that same, of the Congolese army. And that tension recurred really throughout, throughout the mandate, and indeed persists. So I think does pose quite important questions about, where the rubber meets the road in terms of WPS implementation, where we could even be talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity. In Colombia, here, interestingly, the resolutions, the country-specific resolutions make no reference to WPS or 1325. And this, I think, was particularly striking given that those country-specific resolutions come after 2242, which was, principally about making sure the Security Council did integrate WPS into its country-specific resolutions. And I think, and it's also striking, of course, because the Colombian peace agreement itself is I think, rightly celebrated as one that is very positive in many ways on gender, but clearly not a key role for the Security Council there. And in terms of Nepal, it makes only preambular reference to WPS in the country-specific resolutions, which arguably is better than Colombia, but and that was even before Resolution 2242. So what I thought was more interesting, though, in Nepal, actually, which I thought maybe offered some practice that's worth emulating elsewhere, is what we did in Nepal. It was really the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights that was the key UN actor. And what they did establish was quite an effective mechanism where the local office of the High Commission on Human Rights was identifying members of the Nepalese army who were involved in human rights violations during the conflict, was effectively liaising with the UN Department for Peacekeeping to make sure that those same individuals were excluded from the UN's peacekeeping forces in other countries. And that seemed to me a sort of model that could potentially be replicated, with a sort of integration between UN DPKO and the MARA process, if the Security Council really wants to get serious about excluding sexual violence perpetrators from peacekeeping forces. So those findings are all more fully elaborated in the book, which I really hope will be out in the coming weeks with Cambridge. But to conclude, really, just with thanks for the opportunity to speak to that, and sincere thanks to the authors really for producing a report that it not only gives us such a substantial and important evidence base, but also has taken great care in terms of developing a methodology by which we can sort of continue to do this monitoring work. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Sarah, did you want to add something on the question as well?
Yeah, I think I saw a little while ago in the chat, Madeline, that you wanted to make a note on implementation. Do you want to pop in first, and then I'll circle back?
No, actually, because I think it might be better to have all the questions first, because then I can take us into what I think should happen next, maybe.
Okay, so yeah, I think Elena fleshed it out really well, actually. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but I do just want to emphasize, and this also speaks to some of what's going on in the chat, that I think, and even for my own self, I sometimes run over the term of transformative. So I do think that for me, the point of this report is to change and push the limits of what we imagine to be possible with the tools that we already have available. And I think one of the things when you sit with these resolutions, other than just admiring the work of the activists and the diplomats that were able to put these things in place, I think one of the things that does come across is that now really implementation becomes so much more important because of what has been accomplished already. I'll leave it there. Maybe we can get into more questions.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we have another question asking, so I guess to set the stage, we're facing a situation that we've referred to in this conversation as well, where language is a sore point. And we've seen the work of the council come to a slowdown, even standstill, as a result of this. We've seen this most recently with the negotiations around the council response on the COVID-19 pandemic and ceasefires. So reflect on how will a focus on language lead us to the path of implementation of the WPS agenda? And if it helps, should I ask a second question too, so you can kind of take turns? Okay, so the next question is, so that's the first question. The second question is, how do you think the findings of the research, of your research on country-specific resolutions are unique to the WPS agenda? Or is this part of some wider structural issues and challenges that we're facing? I know two very large questions, so.
I'll speak to maybe the first one, yeah, and then we can go back. Yeah. So on the focus on language and how that leads to implementation, actually that was a key reason for me as well behind doing this report at all, was the question of how can we make productive use of Security Council in action. And we know that, of course, within the context of the UN, for reasons that I don't necessarily agree with, I think many of us don't necessarily agree with, the UN Security Council's involvement changes what happens on the ground. I'm so sorry in my apartment, but I think the focus on, hold on, maybe Elena, do you want to go first while I
think you're fine. I think you could just speak through it. It's okay.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So I think it's to make productive use of Security Council in action. So one of the things that we aim to do, and one of the things that I hope came across within the recommendations, is that we can, by increasing the force of the language, I mean, by incorporating and referencing specifically the Women, Peace and Security resolutions, increase their force. And also we do that by connecting them to the other like human rights mechanisms, for example. So by increasing their force, we make it increasingly difficult not to engage with them. And I think that in and of itself will lead to implementation, but of course implementation is a problem. But one of the things that we're looking at as well is how can we do that? And then I also think we can start to think about what forums are appropriate how we can go about achieving implementation for these resolutions without that. I think the research leads to that.
Yes, and I'll speak to the second question about whether this is unique to the WPS agenda. I don't have an evidence-based answer because we haven't looked at the other UN Security Council themes. But from what we know, and we've spoken also to the NGO working group recently, it seems that the WPS agenda is somewhat of an outlier. So for instance, especially if you compare it to the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. And there are reasons for this. One reason is because patriarchy. And this is not necessarily a theme that everyone wants to champion or champions at home or abroad. And the second reason is, as I said, that there are countries that are more vocal advocates for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which then does not translate to the country-specific resolution sometimes because they're not the pen holder or they're not the most prominent voice within the room. I don't know whether it's unique, but because we haven't mapped out the whole universe of different themes, but it seems to be a bit more present here than in some of the themes that most people agree on. Not most countries, not people, most countries agree on, and policymakers.
Great, thank you, Elena and Sarah. Madeline, Christine, did you want to reflect on any of these questions as well?
Christine, do you want to
go? Yeah, I think the only point that I would make is that so often the WPS agenda has been reduced just to the focus on sexual violence. And that there has been sort of such emphasis on that, even their implementation, of course, is extremely weak, but that the sort of much broader agenda, which really relates to women's empowerment, to women's participation, to all the other aspects that would have such important transformative potential, are simply areas where the Security Council, I think Eleanor has just said it, patriarchy, the Security Council just does not perceive as being important and is unwilling to really pursue it. But I think there is another point, which is unlike other thematic agendas, I mean, I think the biggest contrast is with the children and armed conflicts agenda, where there has been much greater willingness to push harder. But unlike other thematic agendas, there are 10 resolutions. I mean, they keep coming back to it, and yet still are not willing to do more than to set it out in the thematic resolutions. And I think in this way, too, it's an outlier.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I agree absolutely with everything everyone has said. And I certainly think that the marginalization of WPS is really quite astonishing when you think how, going back to the beginning, how much work and effort has gone into trying to craft resolutions which are relevant. And going forward, I think one of the things I find very disappointing is that when you come to the planning of new country missions, we're not talking about this agenda at all. This should be a matter of rote. So when there's a new mandate coming up for Sudan, for example, the work and the methodology that has been applied here should be looked at in relation to Sudan to do that, that discussion, that consultation with women on the ground to surface what are the issues that really are pertinent to their needs, rights. And then which of the resolutions really need to be focused on, and then how and who is going to implement them. So essentially in your planning, and it all comes down to planning, let's do the right work first, look at the situation on the ground, have that participation, decide on the strategy that is needed to implement the resolutions, cite the resolutions, use the legal language that gives you the mandate to actually insist on certain things happening, and then use the UN country team to actually implement the various different dimensions. And that's what we get to what Christine was talking about, which is a much more integrated and holistic mechanisms for the overall realization of the rights of women. If we don't do that, then we're going to end up with this, again, back in a silo. And I think it's really very, very relevant that, you know, we're having that discussion 20 years after the passage of 1325. And it should be happening now automatically. The idea that now I have actually I'm trying to think of ways in which we could raise funding to hire you two to do the same thing on the work on the mandate, the planning for Sudan. Now, why are we doing that? We absolutely shouldn't have to be doing that at all. It should be just absolutely at the center of what the UN should do in order to uphold its obligations from the Security Council. Not to mention under human rights law. And good, while I got the table again. I'm really hoping that the Human Rights Council will fulfill its intention to look to pass a resolution in September in which they call on the Office of the High Commissioner to scrutinize their resolutions for the inclusion of women, peace and security language. That will help. And that actually is huge progress, because when you think of it, when before, you know, not 10 years ago, the Human Rights Council wouldn't even think of using women, peace and security language because they said it would detract from the emphasis that's been put on it in the New York-based institutions. So I think let's just have a system whereby the system is made to work, and that the women, peace and security agenda doesn't sit in its little silo where we all talk about it, but then nothing happens.
Doreen, can I just make a quick point?
Go ahead.
So just very quickly, speaking to what Madeline just said and to what Christine just said about the emphasis on sexual violence and conflict. In the context of DRC, if you just a cursory look at it, you'll find all of the resolutions on that specific country situation. There are 85 references to sexual violence and conflict, and there are 17 direct references to participation. And what that indicates is that we're doing it backwards. So by the time we've gotten to protection, we've already failed. And I don't think that because of the preeminence of sexual violence and conflict within the UN, I think that point is not actually necessarily taken into account. And I also think it goes to what's been said within the chat box as well, which is too many words without specific action. I completely agree, but I think it's too many of the wrong words. We've seen that there actually aren't enough words within the country-specific resolutions on WPS. And the point of WPS is that it changes what happens on the ground, and it creates peace in a sustainable way. And so the words that currently there aren't gonna get us where we want to go. So leave it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I think if there isn't anything else on these two questions, we'll move on to the next batch of questions that we have from our participants who have joined us on this call. So let me just take a look at what we have. So I think we can start with the question on similarly asked by Lucy Bolton and Marissa Fortune. So the question from Lucy is, it feels as though momentum on WPS has been lost, and there has been a real backslide on implementation, particularly since the high-level review in 2015. Is this down to a lack of prioritization of the WPS agenda, or is it something else? And what can UN Security Council members do to reverse this trend? And similarly, Marissa, to tag on some of the things that she asked specifically, the question is, political will for implementation seems to be a continuing problem in the work on the WPS agenda. And in your opinion, what is the main source of this lack of commitment, this lacking commitment? So that's one question. It's two questions combined that seem to make sense, like to ask together. So please note that question. The next question is from Graziella Piga. She says, thank you, this is very interesting research, and asks regarding the women, peace and security pillars, which themes did you find were more present in the country's UN Security Council resolutions, and by country? And have you seen if the preference for the specific pillars was correlated to the key countries' issues or not? I feel like these are two large questions, so I'll stop there for now, let you try answering it, and then we'll move on to the next batch. Please go ahead.
I'll start with the second one because it comes on the heels of what both Christine and Sarah were just mentioning. Yes, so even in the country-specific resolutions, just like in everything else around WPS so far, there has been a strong emphasis on protection and sexual violence. So this is the pillar that we see most present. Some of the pillars are just non-existent. The second, and this is far, far behind, the second pillar, and Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the second pillar most prominent is participation. The others are hardly there. If I can't even think of a resolution that actually mentions the other. Sarah, can you think of whether any of the other two pillars are there?
No, it's extremely limited on prevention and on relief and recovery. And I think that's also because those are the most transformative. So the emphasis on prevention, that specific pillar talks about gender mainstreaming, and it talks about the need to incorporate WPS within the context of Security Council resolution, on the country-specific resolution, on the country-specific situation as a whole. So no, there's very limited words on both of those pillars.
Yeah, words is right. Do you want to start on the other question? Do you want me to start on the other question?
You can start.
I have a little to say, and then you can jump in. So what can UN members do to reverse this trend of ignoring WPS? I'll try to address that part. I mean, they can try to familiarize themselves better with WPS, be open to the work of the many advocates and academics, civil society organizations, and activists who do this work, who are deeply familiar with it. Zoe has shared a link to Catherine's recent blog post about what Ireland's election for the UN Security Council means for WPS. So countries can actually try to advocate further for integration of WPS. We know some very powerful countries are the ones reversing this trend on the progress already made until 2019. But I do think there are certain countries that try to portray themselves as advocates for women, for gender equality, if not at home, definitely abroad. And so these countries could definitely take the mantle and try to push forward for creation of certain mechanisms that are needed for monitoring of the, not just the integration, but also the implementation, and try to include the words as well where possible.
Yeah, and to jump in quickly on that, I think as far as like the lack of commitment or the slowing of momentum, I think part of the issue is that the council doesn't prioritize it. They don't put it in the right way. People look at the agenda and say it's the agenda's fault. And then the council, as a result, doesn't prioritize it. And so I think, and that also comes to the fact that when they do put it into the country-specific resolutions, they do focus on it in a backwards way. So I think part of the lack of commitment is just because of the fact that it's not been done in a way that actually makes sense. And I also think that's part of what this report hopefully aims to, or report hopefully will correct, which is that the entire approach to it and the relevance of it needs to be reimagined. And that's one of the things that, as Madeline was mentioning earlier, which we've spoken about throughout this report, that's one of the reasons why we badly need to make specific references to the WPS resolutions within everything that we do.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we can move to the next set of questions. So we have a question from Tandy Shabalala from South Africa, from the South African Mission, based in New York. She says, Resolution 2493 was unanimously adopted during South Africa's presidency of the Council this past October 2019, and it makes reference to the global study on the implementation of the resolution. And more broadly, it reviews some of the gaps and challenges and the lessons learned regarding the implementation of the WPS agenda since 1325. So the question is, how do we use these recommendations on implementation of all WPS resolutions and turn it into action on the ground, and also apply them better across country-specific resolutions? So the question is on how. And she further states, WPS has a rich normative framework, and this review gave a good basis and a starting point to strengthening the full implementation of those resolutions. And then the second question I will pose is from Paul Kirby. I'm not sure from which organization, but Paul Kirby asks, or states, I appreciate the analysis, mainly of council texts, but it would be really, he is interested to hear more about the non-impact of the Security Council Resolution 2242, both in terms of the provision that all country resolutions should have WPS integrated, and also the role of the informal experts group. So particularly the question is it simply that 2242 has been ignored altogether, or has there been some progress, but not enough? And are there specific explanations for this failure? So again, two very large questions. Please take it away, and we'll go to the next set.
I'll speak maybe to the first question, maybe a little bit to the second question, but I'll speak to the first question. So the question of how can we turn this into action? It goes to what Madeline was saying earlier, is that it needs to be in the mandate. It really badly needs to be in the mandate, because that is what gives structure to, even in cases where there are gender advisors. So in a context like DRC, if they're not given the structure within the context of the Security Council resolution itself, they're not able to do what we're telling them to do. And also, I mean, just having numbers on this helps as well, which I would not usually say. But if you look at the context of the DRC mandate, there's 18,000 plus people on it, and there's something like 6 people in headquarters that are working on gender, and then 6 people in the field. That's nowhere near enough, looking at the complexity of the conflict. I mean, it's no shock looking at that we haven't gotten to where we need to be. And then I also think, in terms of how it needs to be, there's a huge impact when, and it shouldn't be this way, but there's a huge impact when the people that are responsible for leading the mandate prioritize WPS. So where there are experts that are speaking to those people that are directly responsible, those people that are at the head of these things, that makes a huge difference. I wish it wasn't the case, but in terms of immediate impact, it does make a difference. And I think there was one other thing that I wanted to say, but now I've completely lost it. So I'll pass it over and then hopefully pick it back up when you guys speak.
I wonder if Madeline, you have anything to say about the how question. Being an academic, I fear I should not necessarily speak over people who actually do the work. But to Paul's question, who is from the center, hi Paul, about the non-impact of UN Security Council 2242 and the provision on WPS integrated agenda. So I think in our analysis, because 2242 was adopted in 2015, we did not necessarily look at the role of the informal experts group, but in all 4 cases, I would say that those resolutions that did contain WPS commitments or stronger language were in the later part of what we were looking at. So in most cases, it was 2011 or 2012 to 2019, except for DRC. So in most cases, the stronger WPS language did appear later on. We did not specifically look at comparing timelines in a way and whether 2242 had a direct impact, but on the basis of just this skewed results time-wise, I would suggest that there's a possibility of this resolution actually having an impact. But I wouldn't necessarily bet on it, but there is a possibility there we haven't established a causal link, so to say.
Can I jump in on the implementation question? Oh, Sarah, if you remember what you were going to say.
Yeah, I did, but it's only very quick. Just speaking to the role of the IEG, we've heard that the role of the IEG also cannot be overstated in terms of providing the support that people like gender advisors or people working on gender at the UN don't usually get. So it puts a kind of expertise that, again, shouldn't necessarily be siloed into the IEG as it is. It should be that the activists, those on the ground, are considered experts of their own situation, but that's just not the case. So we have heard that the IEG's role in encouraging implementation is a large one. So that's what I remembered. So go ahead, Madeline. Sorry.
And that actually is very good, because that leads into what I was going to say, because it's all about teamwork, really. Because if you talk about the implementation of the resolutions, it cannot happen without the participation of the women stakeholders in the country. They have got to be at the center of the design of everything that should be happening in response to either the attempts to build peace or then the transitions from conflict. That's absolutely crucial, because that's the thing that's going to provide the sort of guidance which is going to need the sort of support in order to get to that sustainable, transformative justice. So if that's our starting point, then what we've got to do is find ways of transferring that information through the language that the UN has adopted into action. So it starts with the words from the Security Council, which then have got to be, and this is really so important, the informal expert group, the champions that we've got in the Security Council, of which South Africa has been one, Germany is one, we have several, who I know have worked really, really hard to try and make this agenda work, but we need you to be able to then link that to those in the UN system who are the agents on the ground to make this happen. That means making sure that the SRSGs are absolutely held accountable for ensuring that the language is incorporated in the actions that they take, not just in the mandates that you give them. So it's got to go from that into the SGs. Let's get far more feminist SRSGs out there. We need to actually have that. We need to have far more people in positions of authority within the UN who understand this agenda. Because without that, we're not going to get the right sort of implementation in any case. So essentially what we need to be able to do is to bring that information from the ground, look to the language of the resolutions, have the informal expert group of the champions and Security Council, push the UN agencies to actually do the planning and develop their strategies on the basis of that. And then what we can have is an integrated plan in country as to which organization, which part of the UN, whether it's going to be UNICEF, whether it's going to be Office of High Commission, if they're going to have a mandate to be there, who is taking responsibility for the coordination of the different elements of the resolutions which have to be implemented. So for example, if you're looking at judicial reform, and there's always judicial reform in post-conflict countries, one of the things that's demanded by the resolutions is that it be gender sensitive, there be particular new ways of approaching criminal justice in particular. Now, who would be responsible for that? Usually it's some combination of OHCHR with UNDP. Well, we want to make sure then that the information, the advice, the training, the drafting that is done is based on the language of 2467. So that we then find ways of crafting a different gendered approach to criminal justice in that transitional moment than we would have otherwise. And it's got to be front and center because the Security Council has said so. So it's just actually making common sense of everything that we have. It's the electrons that we need, the electrons that are the words from the resolutions which we need to put out there and make them real. And just to say, I really love the Sinatra test as well, because if we can get the language in the Security Council past some of the, some of the worst representatives of the great powers in the Security Council at the moment, if you can still do that, then we can make it work in somewhere like Sudan or DRC.
Thanks, Madeline. Sarah, did you have something? Were you indicating to speak?
No, I was indicating that the Sinatra reference was one that I also enjoyed. But I don't know if Christine has anything to add, maybe.
Okay. Christine, because I can't see you, so. Okay, I think no. Okay, so our next question is from Uruj Mian. Not sure again which organization. I think a few people who have asked questions haven't identified which organization, but that's okay. Uruj Mian is asking, are you able to expand? She would like you to expand on your rationale on choosing these specific case studies, the DRC, Libya, Yemen, Syria. So if you could expand on that, and also, how do you believe the findings are going to differ from the application of your methodology in a more quote unquote stable country setting? Is Uruj's question. Another question we have is from Jane Namourier. And Jane is asking if you could share your plans for South Sudan, as the cases are almost similar to those in the DRC. If you do have those plans, please share. I'll let you respond to these, and then we'll see if we have other questions that we can pose to you before we start to close.
Thank you for the questions. I mean, thank you for all the questions, obviously, not just these. So I spoke briefly about the rationale of the specific case studies. We had to limit ourselves to only 4, and even that I think might have been a stretch because of the time constraints within which we worked. So we tried to do a mix of different UN mechanisms, type of mandates, and length of mandates as well, which is why we chose some with sanctions, some without sanctions, some together with UNHCR mandate, then a case like DRC where the UN has been present in the country for decades, and so on. How these would differ from application in more stable country settings. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by more stable country settings, because right now I can hardly think of stable countries. But also I'm not familiar with the UN Security Council necessarily passing resolutions, which is a problem in and of itself, but passing resolutions for stable countries or countries that are not conflict affected. That being said, though, I don't necessarily see this differing unless something changes in the system or in the way things are done. What was the second question? There was a second question.
The second question asks if you could share whether you have future plans for South Sudan, as the cases are almost similar to those in the DRC.
I mean, if we had it our way, we would have analyzed all the country-specific resolutions. But no, for the time being, we don't have plans for expanding the research on other countries. But that being said, we do hope that the methodology that we provide, and in the report it's quite detailed, can be replicated by other researchers and look into other country-specific resolutions. And then I would actually be quite curious to compare notes on what others find for other countries and whether they find anything that can be, like Catherine was saying about Nepal, even though not necessarily in relation to WPS directly, whether they can be positive lessons that we take elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think this is a moment to also mention that Sarah mentioned this earlier, that you could take a look at the CSO guide that is also out and is a supplement to this report to take a look at the case of South Sudan. Okay.
Yeah, and I think quickly to really drive that point home is that we really want you to do this in your own context. We need the Security Council resolutions to become more accessible. We need people to be familiar with them, and I think there's no reason why they shouldn't be. I think part of the issue is that that for maybe it was intentional, maybe it's necessary, maybe not. But I think for whatever reason, it's become its own language, its own thing that is extremely difficult to penetrate. So our research, one of the reasons why it took the time that it did was because we also had the mapping of the WPS resolutions to do. So we also had that understanding. We had to develop the methodology. What I'm hoping is that you won't need to start from scratch now. It won't take as long as it necessarily took us. You can just take it, hook, line, and sinker, please do. through the CSO guide there, we included the tables. I'm happy to make the research that we've already done available and accessible in whatever way it needs to be made available, because the point is for it to be used. And the point is for it to be applied to any country situation that's on the Security Council agenda. So just really wanted to drive that home.
Okay, great. It doesn't seem to be Elena is trying to talk. You're smiling. Okay. Madeline, did you want to make a comment?
No, just to echo completely what Sarah has just said, because it's out there now. We know how it's not working. So I think the most important thing now is for everyone on this call to spread the word, to say this is how we can make it work, and to reclaim ownership of the agenda so that we actually do see the fundamental changes that we were hoping the agenda would actually create for women on the ground. Otherwise, we are failing them. But I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure both working with Sarah and Elena. They have done an amazing job in putting this together. Christine Chinkin for the expertise she always provides and the generosity of her time, as always, on making sure that the legal aspects were completely erudite. And I think so important that all of this is based on law. So really, I think a really excellent report, and I thank them very much for their incredible application, diligence and intelligence, wit, charm and personality in doing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline.
Do you mind if I add something very quickly?
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a note on the inaccessibility. I think I want to just make it clear why that's an issue, is just because it changes the power dynamic in situations. So civil society to the Security Council, the power dynamic, the gap, the valley between that sometimes feels extreme. Even for me, walking in there, I am, you know, it's intentionally intimidating. And so I think part of what this report aims to do is to equip civil society with what they need to say, hey, like, we actually thought of this. I know you've put it into your language, but we actually thought of this and we understand how it's done. Here, if it needs to be in your language, here it is. And now let's get on with it. So I think that's part of it.
And on the issue of language, yes, those that are advocating to the UN themselves are important. But I hope that there will be people who might translate some of our findings in the guide and the key things that we have found in other languages as well, that will help people on the ground, women and feminists on the ground, to advance this further within their country context as well. And thank you, Madeline. That was very, very kind. And thank you for all your guidance throughout this process.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Oh, Madeline, was that you?
No, it's me, Christine.
Oh, Christine, go ahead.
No, I was just going to make 2 points. One, again, to thank Madeline, obviously, but I think that it was especially, and I think Eleanor would probably share this, that it's really illuminating for us as academics to see how academic work can be translated into practice and be brought to bear in that way. And I think that this conjunction between activism and academia is just really so important. And so to thank for the opportunity for doing that. But I also think that the other big message that is coming out of all of this is that sort of reform of the Security Council generally has rather gone off the agenda in recent years. And we might have a discussion as to why that is so. But I think what we're clearly seeing is both the lack of coordination within the council itself. Eleanor, you've mentioned several times different pen holders, and different pen holders who've got different priorities, different agendas, and so on, and how that doesn't necessarily translate into a coordinated approach that gets continued through successive resolutions. Elected members, they come on just for 2 years. As far as I know, it's not a criteria for election to have a commitment to WPS. That might be, you know, a great idea, but they're there for 2 years, then they move off, other states come in. So we get that always having to try to ensure that states who have got this commitment are actually there. And then we also see, I mean, several people have been saying on the chat, well, what about a working group on WPS within the Security Council? What about a committee like the Sanctions Committee or the Counter-Terrorism Committee? Something that, you know, actually gave it heavy weight and requiring countries to report back on what they're doing with respect to WPS. And then, of course, you know, why UN Women? Why CEDAW? You've got so many different bodies within the UN. You've mentioned the Human Rights Council several times. Again, to try and coordinate all of those to really give that push that is necessary to try and ensure, as all of you have said, obviously share, that the huge commitment that is coming from women's organizations and civil society is translated into all of these various levels of the UN.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you for that. I think, so we've covered a lot in the 1.5 hours that we did have together. We're going to have to wrap up. We're like a minute over. We're going to wrap up. So again, thank you to everybody, all our speakers, Sarah, Elena, Madeline, Christine, and the questions from the participants in this discussion. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think many people are very interested to read the report. We've had a few questions asking a link for the report. We've shared that. And also the CSO guide. So what we've heard is that we need the right words in the right places. And more importantly, we need to train our eye on implementation, towards implementation and accountability to the WPS agenda. And many, we could see from the comments and the conversation in this discussion, many feel the momentum on WPS has been slowed down or even lost. And that WPS must be a priority across the work of the UN Security Council. This report specifically is meant to inform accountability and advocacy with UN Security Council members. It encourages us to make use of the UN Security Council in action, in adequate action, in a space where we have 10 resolutions already, and implementation continues to remain underfinanced and underattended. It also tells us to put resolutions into action by making sure that they are present in country-specific resolutions. And of course, this report is not meant to be an exhaustive research. It's not meant to be providing such a thing, but it's meant to be an opening for further work, both in terms of research and advocacy, to be done in holding the UN Security Council as a whole and certain specific member states to account. We hope that this conversation has been useful for your work going forward. We will be in touch with follow-up after this meeting with, I think, the link to the reporting guide, just as a follow-up to what's been shared in the chat. And we're also going to we're going to determine if we can share the recording as well, as some people have inquired about that. So with that said, again, many thanks. Lovely to talk with all of you, to hear from all of you. And to see, you know, what the culmination of many months of hard work in this discussion. Wishing everyone a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you.